Welcome to Chapter 26, which is about the colonization of land. Really, it's about fungi and plants in particular. So we're going to talk about what makes a fungus and a couple key fungal groups, and then we'll talk about what makes a plant, what makes a plant able to live on land, plant life cycle, and some select plant groups. And then we'll kind of talk about the importance of plants and fungi as well. So with the colonization of land, for more than the first 2 billion years of Earth's history, the terrestrial surface was actually lifeless, which is sort of hard to imagine considering what it looks like now, but it was lifeless. Cyanobacteria, which are those photosynthetic bacteria, and protists likely existed on land about 1.2 billion years ago, and around 500 million years ago, small plants, fungi, and animals emerged on land. Forests formed about 385 million years ago, and plants and fungi colonized land together as partners before animals arrived on land. So the earliest land plants lacked true roots and leaves, so plants formed a symbiotic association with fungi, and those fungi helped them obtain nutrients. However, despite this close interaction, fungi and plants are actually not closely related. So animals are actually more closely related to fungi than fungi and plants are to each other. So if you remember the eukaryotic supergroups, remember the plants are in a different supergroup than animals and fungi are. So with fungus characteristics, like what makes a fungus, they are eukaryotic organisms. They're in the supergroup Uniconta and the clade Opisthoconta. Remember that clade Opisthoconta includes animals as well as some other protists. Fungi have cell walls made of chitin that restricts their motility and also prevents phagocytosis. So even though they're heterotrophic like animals, they have to have an absorptive nutrition. Generally what they do is they release hydrolytic enzymes outside of their body and then absorb smaller molecules back into their body. They store carbohydrates as glycogen like animals do. Plants store their carbs as starch, so that's a difference between plants and fungi. Fungi can either be multicellular or unicellular. If they're multicellular, then their body is called mycelia or mycelium, and it's made up of chains of cells that are called hyphae. We call single-celled fungi yeast. Fungi can have either sexual or asexual reproduction, and most have that haploid dominant life cycle. We haven't really talked about septate or aseptate hyphae yet, but hyphae are those chains of cells, and hyphae can either be septate or aseptate. A septum is a dividing wall, like in between your nostrils you have an intranasal septum, right? So that's that dividing wall between your nostrils. So in our pictures here, let's label the fungi as either septate or aseptate. What's that root word a mean again? That means not or without. So this first set here does not have dividing walls, so this is aseptate, right? This second picture here has those dividing walls, so this is septate. And then if we look at the actual microscope images here, this fungus has dividing walls, right? So that's going to be septate. And these guys don't have any dividing walls, so that's going to be aseptate there. So with asexual fungal reproduction, they could actually do this with multiple cells or single-celled. With multicellular asexual fungal reproduction, they can produce these asexual spores that are called conidia. So these individual spores will detach and grow an entirely new individual. Or they could do single-celled asexual reproduction where this piece here buds off and becomes a new fungus. So yeast do budding for asexual. So when fungi do sexual reproduction, they have a haploid dominant life cycle, meaning most of their body is actually haploid. And the gametes are actually hyphal branches that have, their haploid cell number. They're going to grow together. They actually release peptides into the soil that attracts compatible mating types. There's not like technically a male and female because they don't have the same size difference of gametes as like plants and animals have sperm and egg, but the hyphae are actually the same size. They just have compatible mating types and they grow together. And then when those hyphae fuse, the first step is plasmogamy, which is the fusion of the cytoplasm. So now the hyphae have 2 haploid nuclei, so we call that the dikaryotic stage, right? Di is 2, karyoticus nuclei, so dikaryotic is the 2 nuclei stage. And those 2 nuclei are genetically different, right? That's kind of the whole point of sexual reproduction, to get different genetic material together. And then that dikaryotic mycelium produces a fruiting body. And then you have karyogamy, which is when the nuclei fuse together, so you get a diploid zygote. Then that diploid zygote undergoes meiosis and produces haploid spores. So the fruiting body of a fungus is important for spore dispersal, and some fruiting bodies contain substances to deter consumption, like they have substances that would cause liver failure, or hallucinogenic or psychoactive substances can be found in fruiting bodies as well. So here we've got kind of a picture or a diagram of that fungal life cycle, both sexual and asexual. So you might need to pause, but give it a moment and look at the picture and see which part of the cycle is showing sexual reproduction and which part is showing asexual reproduction. So if we look at the picture here, starting on the kind of smaller side here, right, we've got the mycelium, which is the body of the fungus, and then it produces spore-producing structures, which make spores that grow up to become new mycelium. So this whole entire everything here is haploid, right? So this is going to be asexual reproduction. We don't have any fusion of anything. It's just pretty simple. So then on this other side, we have the mycelium and we have plasmogamy or fusion of cytoplasm. So 2 hyphae grow together and fuse together. Then we have that heterokaryotic stage, which our previous slide said dikaryotic stage, but that's saying the same thing, right? Di is 2, hetero is different. So heterokaryotic different nucleus stage or dikaryotic 2 nucleus stage. It's literally the same thing. Then the nuclei fuse, you get a diploid zygote, right? It says diploid is pink. So we have this temporary diploid stage. There's meiosis involved, and then spore producing structures produce spores. Then those spores grow up to become new fungus. So this is going to be sexual reproduction because there are different genetic material fusing together. And there's also meiosis involved as well. So as far as fungal diversity goes, I feel like I keep saying, oh, there's some uncertainty about this due to new molecular analyses, but they've recently been working on the fungal classification as well. So molecular analyses have helped clarify some evolutionary relationships and have changed some fungal relationships. For example, zygomycetes, which are not listed there, were found to be polyphyletic. So this has changed semi-recently and may change again. There's about 100,000 known species of fungi, but there's estimated to be as many as 1.5 million species of fungi. And really, the fungi that I'm going to have you guys memorize are the Ascomycetes and Basidiomycetes because they are the most numerous, and those groups have been pretty consistent here in recent times. With the Ascomycetes, there's about 90,000 species of Ascomycetes, and they live in all kinds of environment, marine, freshwater, terrestrial. They have septate hyphae, and when they do sexual reproduction, they produce this sac-like structure that's called an ascus, and that ascus produces ascospores inside of that sac-like structure, and then those are in a fruiting body that's called an ascocarp, and that ascocarp is often cup-shaped, like the scarlet elf cup mushroom is here. So that's Ascomycete. Here's kind of a typical life cycle of the Ascomycetes, they could do either asexual reproduction or sexual reproduction. If they do sexual reproduction, that positive and negative compatible mating types grow together and they fuse, the hyphae fuse, then the nuclei fuse, right, in that fruiting body, and then that diploid ascus here undergoes meiosis to produce spores. Those spores are multiplied with mitosis, and then those spores can grow up to become new mycelia or new fungus. Basidiomycetes is another very numerous fungal group. There's about 50,000 species of Basidiomycetes, and these are important decomposers. They're also important ectomycorrhizal fungi. Also, generally when you're thinking of a mushroom, you're probably thinking of Basidiomycetes, right? Look at that guy. That's a pretty big mushroom there. Edible. I'm not saying they're all edible, but typically when you think of a mushroom, you're thinking Basidiomycetes. They have septate hyphae, and when they do sexual reproduction, they're commonly called club fungi because they have these little club-like basidia here that produce a basidiospore, and then their fruiting body is called basidiocarp. So here's the life cycle of Basidiomycetes, right? So we've got compatible hyphae that are growing together and it forms that dikaryotic structure. So here we have a dikaryotic basidiocarp, right? The fruiting body. And then there's this short diploid phase where this diploid cell does meiosis and produces those basidiospores, which are on the club-like basidium. So that's the basidium here. These are little basidiospores there. And each of those basidiospores grow up to become, it's supposed to be an arrow, grow up to become new fungi. So there are other fungal groups. Don't memorize these, but just to kind of introduce you to some fungal. There's the Mucoromycetes, which they include fast-growing molds like black bread mold. Some of them produce zygospores during sexual reproduction. Some of them, this picture over here is a zygospore. Some of them form arbuscular mycorrhizae inside of, this is a root, right? And then there's mycorrhizae that grow inside of the root and around the root to increase the surface area of the root. There are chytrids, which have flagellated spores, and they're widely distributed in lakes and soil. They are also infamous for their role in declining amphibian populations. There's different species of chytrids that infect different amphibians. There's different ones for frogs and salamanders. There are microsporidians here. This is a unicellular parasite of protist animals cells, and then there's cryptomycetes, which are parasites of other fungi or protists. This is one fungal species, and then these little spores here are the parasites inside of that other fungal species. So don't memorize these. This is just to give you an example of some fungal diversity. So fungi in general are important because they're decomposers. Only bacteria and fungi can actually break down cellulose. What's cellulose in? That's the material in plant cell walls. Also, fungi are important decomposers in releasing minerals and other nutrients to the soil and water. Some fungi are predators. Like this one is pretty cool here. It has this little hyphal loop that's like a lasso, and it grabbed this nematode. This nematode is a roundworm. So it's this tiny lasso on this tiny little worm there, which is kind of neat. Some of them are pathogens, like this baby has oral thrush here, so a yeast infection of the mouth. Athlete's foot is a fungal infection as well. So they can be pathogens to plants and animals. Also, fungi are important for food production reasons, right? Yeast is important for making bread and beer and wine, and some cheeses. rely on fungi as well. And then fungi have beneficial associations with photosynthetic partners as well, and we'll get to those coming up in their own slides here. So mycorrhizae, that root word myco is referring to the fungus, and rhizae is referring to roots or root-like structures. So the hyphae of some fungi live in and around the roots of many different plants. So in this first picture here, this plant with a larger root surface area has been inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi, whereas this is the same species here, but it was not inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. So there's smaller surface area to that roots. Or to those roots. So there's ectomycorrhizae and endomycorrhizae. Ecto is outside. So the ectomycorrhizae, they don't actually grow inside of the cells, right? They're not inside of the cells. They're around and between the cells, still increasing the root surface area. Endomycorrhizae, on the other hand, are actually inside the cells and also, outside and around, but they actually penetrate into the cells and grow inside of the cells. This includes the arbuscular mycorrhizae. There's some fungal endophytes. Again, the root word endo means inside of, phyte means leaf. That's pretty hard to get you a picture of, because technically this endophyte here in this picture, here's the leaf, right? And you can see some of that fungus is coming out of the leaf. So technically in this picture, it's not all inside of the leaf, but there's some of it inside of the leaf as well. So fungal endophytes live within the leaf and stem tissues of various plants. And endophytes do benefit from this relationship because they obtain organic molecules from the plant, but they contribute things like toxins or antibiotics that can deter foraging animals. So herbivores are deterred, insect pests are deterred, and microbial pathogens would be limited as well. So plants with endophytes often grow better than plants of the same species if they do not have the endophyte. So lichen, or when there is a partnership of a particular fungi and either photosynthetic green algae or cyanobacteria, there's 25,000 or so lichen species, and they are not all descended from a common ancestor, and it's not all the same fungus or all the same algae. So this has evolved in at least 5 separate fungal lineages. So lichen are actually pretty complex. There's 3 major growth forms: crustose, foliose, and fruticose, which I'll show you guys on the next slide. And the photosynthetic partner, so the green algae or cyanobacterium, provides organic molecules produced in photosynthesis and oxygen to the fungal partner. And the fungal partner increases the surface area and provides carbon dioxide, water, and minerals. So you may have seen lichen before. It's kind of that crusty stuff that grows on rocks there. So this form of lichen is called crustose lichen. Foliose is named because the lichen looks a little bit more leaf-like. And then fruticose, to me it kind of looks like bushy almost. So that's fruticose lichen there. And this is a microscopic view of lichen. You can see the photosynthetic partner up here in green, and then more of the fungal partner down in this region there. So let's review what is a key difference between basidiomycetes and ascomycetes. So that would be where the spores are produced. So basidiomycetes, they produce their basidiospores on club-like basidia, and then ascomycetes produce ascospores in a sac-like ascus. Okay, the drawing gets a little challenging here. Okay, so my spore number is inaccurate, but the general diagram is decent. So basidiomycetes are club fungi, that's their kind of common name, and ascomycetes are sac fungi. What's the fungal association with plant roots that increases the surface area of the plant root? So that's mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae is that fungal association with plant roots that increases the surface area of the plant root. And then characteristics that you would look for to determine if something is in the fungal kingdom or not. So what kind of cells do they have? Prokaryotic or eukaryotic? Eukaryotic cells. They've got cell walls. Those cell walls are made of chitin. They could be single-celled or multicellular, so that doesn't help us too much. They do asexual or sexual reproduction, so that doesn't help us very much. If they are multicellular, though, they're going to have those chains of cells that are called hyphae that make up the mycelium, and they may produce like a mushroom-like fruiting body in sexual reproduction. They're also going to have spores in some cases. And they have that haploid dominant life cycle. So those are some characteristics you could look for to see if they were fungi or not. So that brings us to kind of the plant part of this chapter. Again, plants and fungi, even though they're in the same chapter, they're not closely like genetically related. Instead, they're lumped in the same chapter together because they colonize land together. So the ancestors to plants are algal. So green algae are the closest relatives of land plants if we look at both nuclear and chloroplast genes. And land plants share certain traits only with charophyte algae. They have rings of cellulose synthesizing complexes. They have similar structure in their flagellated sperm, and they have something called sporopollinein. In the charophytes, it prevents exposed zygotes from drying out, and it's also found in the spore walls of plants. So remember, land plants and modern-day charophytes are not necessarily similar, but land plants and modern-day charophytes share a common ancestor. So early life on land had some advantages for plants. So there was unfiltered sunlight, so more light available. There's more plentiful carbon dioxide and potentially nutrient-rich soil, depending upon what time we're talking about they arrived on land. As far as challenges go, though, obviously on land there's a lack of water, and then the plants had to deal with like a lack of structural support for their bodies. If you take algae out of water, it kind of flops around, right? It's not really supported, whereas plants on their own are able to support their bodies without water. Well, I mean, they have to have water inside their body because they're roughly 70% water, but you get what I'm saying? Like they don't need to have the water outside of their body to hold their body up. So what makes a plant a plant? Plants are eukaryotic and plants are multicellular. We would expect them to be photosynthetic, although I put a little asterisk on photosynthetic because some plants have evolved special adaptations to be like parasitic plants, right? But typically we would expect a plant to be photosynthetic. Their cells have plastids. They have cellulose cell walls. They have that alternation of generations or sporic life cycle. They primarily live on land, whereas their green algal ancestors were aquatic. Now, are there plants that are specially adapted to live in water? Yes, but generally speaking, plants live on land. And a key adaptation for plants is embryo protection. So we would consider plants to be embryophytes, although that is another area that is currently an area of debate. Like, where are we separating algae and plants? So our book goes with the kind of classic definition with plants being embryophytes, so that's what we're going to go with. There's also a huge range in size of plants, right? Up here we've got the smallest plant, duckweed, and the largest plant, the giant redwood. I'm not saying you should drive your tree through a giant redwood or cut holes in them. I'm not saying that, but I got you this picture, or I found this picture because I think it really gives you an idea of the size and scale of that tree. So plants have adaptations to living on land. They have that alternation of generations life cycle, which if you forgot about that, we'll go over it on the next slide. They also have a desiccation resistant reproductive cell. So they've got spores that resist drying out. And then they have structures to generate, protect, and disperse those reproductive cells. As far as their body goes, they have meristems, which are specialized tissue which can continue to divide and grow, right? Like you mow your lawn and your lawn grows back because of meristems. Whereas like there are some exceptions to animals, right? But many animals, if you cut off chunks of them, many animals are not going to grow back. And if they do grow back, it takes a lot more effort than the grass growing back. Body plan of plants, they also have kind of this 3D tissue structure compared to algae, which is more flat, and that helps prevent water loss. They also have more robust bodies, which are covered in a waxy cuticle to prevent water loss, and they have stomata, which are specialized pores to exchange gas with their bodies and the environment. So if you forgot about that alternation of generations life cycle from Bio 1, here it is again. So it's alternation of generations because there are two multicellular generations in the plant. There is a diploid sporophyte generation and a haploid gametophyte generation. Remember, diploid means 2 sets of chromosomes, haploid means 1 set of chromosome. So this multicellular diploid phase is called the sporophyte, and the sporophyte undergoes meiosis, which is that reduction division, and produces haploid spores. Then those haploid spores do mitosis and grow up to become the multicellular haploid gametophyte generation. That haploid gametophyte generation does mitosis, which is the cell division that maintains the chromosome number and produces haploid gametes. What's a gamete? That's sperm and egg, right? So then sperm and egg fuse in fertilization, and now we get a diploid zygote, right? Haploid plus haploid gives us a diploid zygote. That diploid zygote grows up to become the diploid multicellular sporophyte generation. So in plants, they have a dominant generation and a more reduced generation. The dominant generation, we're not talking about Mendelian genetics, dominant, recessive. That's not what we're talking about. In plants, the dominant generation is the larger, more complex, longer-lived generation. In most plants, the sporophyte is the dominant form. So like if you are looking at an oak tree, you are really looking at the sporophyte generation, the diploid generation. In most plants, the gametophyte generation, the haploid generation, is really reduced. So this image is not to scale at all, right? But if this was like an oak tree or something, like this is the pollen and this is the embryo sac, so the male and female gametophyte. That pollen, oh my gosh, it would be that tall if this was to scale. The pollen is not that tall. Pollen is microscopic, right? So this image is not to scale, but it's trying to show you that there's different dominant generations. So in most plants, the sporophyte generation is dominant. However, in a plant group called the bryophytes, the non-vascular plants, that haploid gametophyte is the dominant form. So plant embryos then are multicellular. They're diploid, right? 2N. Oh, that was supposed to be 2N. Just pretend it's a 2. Go with it. And they are retained within the tissues of the female gametophyte. Now, we haven't gone over plant groups yet, but it depends what plant group we're talking about, what retained within the female gametophyte tissue looks like. So it could be retained within a seed, or it could be retained within part of like more of the plant itself if it's a seedless plant. Nutrients are transferred from the parent to the embryo through something called placental transfer cells. So we call land plants embryophytes because the embryo is protected by the maternal tissue. So plant spores, we said fungi have spores, plants have spores as well, not because they share common ancestors with spores, but just it's a reproductive structure. So plant spores are haploid and they're walled, and those spores are produced in structures called sporangia. Sporangia are multicellular organs. So this picture here, this is moss, and this is the sporangium here, and you can see over here on the microscopic side there's all of these spores inside of that sporangium. The spore walls also contain sporopollenin, which makes them resistant to harsh environments. So why are plants better suited to a terrestrial environment than green algae? So if you want to pause, you can pause for a moment. So plants are better suited to living on land than green algae would be, because plants have that kind of more robust 3D body shape, which limits their water loss. Their bodies are covered in a waxy cuticle. They've got spores that resist drying out. They have those meristems that help them regenerate. So lots of reasons plants are better suited to living on land than algae would be. Number 7, true or false? Plants produce gametes, which is sperm and egg, by mitosis. Explain your answer. Ooh, so that is actually true. That's not how animals make gametes, but remember, plants have that alternation of generations life cycle. So their haploid gametophyte generation produces the gametes that are also haploid by mitosis. So that brings us to plant diversity. So there's, lots of different kinds of plants, lots of diversity in plants, but the groups of plants that we're going to focus on are the bryophytes, in particular the mosses. Then in the seedless vascular plants, we're going to focus on the manilophytes, which are the ferns. In the gymnosperms, we're going to focus on the conifers, and in the flowering plants, that would be angiosperms. So we're going to talk about each of those coming up and their characteristics. So our first plant clade is the bryophytes. These are the seedless vascular plants. It includes liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. The one I want you to remember is the mosses. So down here, this is a moss. That's a liverwort. The other one here is a hornwort here. They are non-vascular. They are seedless. They are gametophyte dominant. So remember, that's that haploid part of the alternation of generations life cycle. They have flagellated sperm, so they are limited to living in moist environments where the sperm can swim from one moss to another to fertilize the egg in the other moss. Also, moths don't get really tall because moths don't have lignin, which is a material that strengthens cell walls. And since mosses don't have vascular tissue, they don't have true roots, true stems, or true leaves. Instead, they have structures for roots that are called rhizoids. It's not roots, though, because it doesn't have vascular tissue. So on that alternation of generations life cycle, a lot of people really struggle with that. So I'm going to go over the alternation of generations life cycle for our different plant groups to kind of help you get that a little bit more lined out for you. But there's actually individual male and female moss, and the male moss produces sperm and the female moss produces eggs, right? And the sperm in a moist environment swims to the egg, and that egg gets fertilized and produces a diploid zygote. That diploid zygote undergoes mitosis to produce a multicellular structure here, which is this little guy on the stalk thing here, which is the diploid sporophyte generation. This diploid sporophyte generation produces spores by meiosis. Since it's doing meiosis, those spores are haploid, right? Then those spores undergo mitosis to grow up and become new moss gametophyte generations. So that brings us to the seedless vascular plants. This includes the lycophytes and the member that we're going to memorize, the manilophytes. which are the ferns. So this one here, the kind of bushy looking one, is lycophyte, and down here at the bottom picture, that's a fern. So these are vascular plants, meaning they have xylem and phloem. They can get larger than moss because they do contain lignin. They do not have seeds though. They still have to grow in moist environments because they still have flagellated sperm. But unlike moss, the ferns are sporophyte dominant, and since they have vascular tissue, they can have true roots, stems, and leaves. So here's that life cycle of a fern. If we start with like what actually looks like a fern, right, the kind of leafy looking part here, that's the diploid sporophyte generation. On that sporophyte, there are these little sori, which produce the spores in sporangia. Those spores are produced by meiosis, so we go from diploid to haploid spores. Those haploid spores grow up by mitosis to produce a multicellular gametophyte generation. In this case, this like heart-shaped structure is the gametophyte generation. This other part in this picture here is the sporophyte that'll grow up into, you know, the leafy looking fern there. There's my art. So then this gametophyte generation actually produces the egg or the sperm, depending on if it's male or female. And then those sperm can swim to the egg, fertilize the egg. We get a diploid zygote, right? And that zygote grows up by mitosis and becomes the mature sporophyte generation. So number 8, true or false, all plants have seeds and pollen. Oh, that's false, right? We haven't talked about any plants that have seeds and pollen so far yet. So bryophytes, which are mosses, and the manilophytes, which are ferns, both don't have seeds or pollen. So that's false. Number 9, which generation, sporophyte or gametophyte, is dominant in mosses, hornworts, and liverworts? That is the gametophyte generation, which is the haploid generation. And those are the only plants that have a dominant gametophyte generation. Everybody else is sporophyte dominant. So that brings us to the gymnosperms. So gymnosperms include cycads, which is what this picture is, ginkgos, which is a common like landscaping plant, and there's only one genus of it, but ginkgos have these unique fan-shaped leaves, and conifers, which are going to be our representative member. So like a pine tree is a conifer, something with cones is a conifer. So gymnosperms have vascular tissue. They have seeds, but they're said to be naked seed plants because the seed is not enclosed in an ovary and they don't produce true fruit. So they have seeds, but no flowers or fruit. They have pollen, which none of the other plants before have had, and they have ovules, which protects the female gametophyte generation. They're sporophyte dominant, so when you're looking at a pine tree, you're looking at the diploid sporophyte generation. And since they have vascular tissue, they can have true roots, stems, and leaves. They also can produce wood. So here again is the old alternation in generations life cycle, although this just got a little bit more complex, right? So if we start with our diploid sporophyte generation, now we've got a little bit more complication because we've got pollen cones here, which produce microspores, which grow up to become pollen, which is the male gametophyte generation. And we've got seed cones, which have the ovule, which is the egg, and they also have this megaspore mother cell, which grows up to become the female gametophyte generation here. This grows up to become megaspores, which then grows up to the female gametophyte generation. So anyhow, the pollen gets to the seed cone through the air because it's a conifer, and then the pollen carries the sperm, and the sperm fertilizes the egg inside of the female gametophyte. Then we get this diploid zygote that is retained within a seed. And if the seed makes it to the right conditions, right, then the seed inside the seed there's this embryo, and this embryo grows up to become the mature sporophyte generation. So that's our alternation of generations in the conifer, which is a gymnosperm. So it's a little bit more complicated because now there's two kinds of spores, microspores and megaspores, and two kinds of gametophytes, the male gametophyte, which is the pollen, and the female gametophyte there. So that's a little bit more complicated. So just to give you kind of a brief overview of the different kinds of gymnosperms, again, the one I want you to memorize is the conifers. So conifers are named for their seed cones, but they also have these papery pollen cones. So the small little pine cones don't grow up one day to become the big like woody cone. This woodier looking cone is the seed cone, and this papery cone is a pollen cone. There's some genuses of Coniferophyta though that don't look anything like pine trees, like Ephedra, Needham, and Welwitschia. So if you ever take a botany class, don't be like, oh, only pine trees are conifers. Again, we talked about ginkgo with this fan-shaped leaf being an important landscaping plant. There's only one species in the genus ginkgo remaining. Generally, they plant male trees because the females have these fleshy seed coats that are pretty foul-smelling. And then cycads are primarily tropical and subtropical plants. They're also ornamental plants, and they have these cone-like structures that attract beetles for pollination. So that brings us to probably what you think of as a plant when you think about plants, because I know you always think about plants, right? So angiosperms are flowering plants. That doesn't mean you could put them in a bouquet necessarily, although I suppose you could. But like this is side oats here. This is also a flowering plant. It just is a reduced flower. And then a sunflower has a special kind of flower. So not all flowering plants look exactly the same with their flowers, but angiosperms or flowering plants are the most widespread and diverse plant phylum. Their key characteristic is that they have flowers. They also have vascular tissue and seeds. And then another key characteristic of angiosperms is that seed is enclosed in the ovary and they produce fruit. Those seeds also contain endosperms. They have pollen, just like the gymnosperms, that disperses the male gametophyte generation. They have ovules to protect the female gametophyte generation. They're sporophyte dominant. They have true root stems and leaves, and some of them have wood. So here's that alternation of generations life cycle in angiosperms, right? If we start at the diploid sporophyte generation, this happens to be a complete flower with both male and female parts. So the male parts of the flower produce microspores, which grow up to become pollen, which is the male gametophyte, right? The female parts of the plant have megaspores, which grow up to become the embryo sac, which is the female gametophyte generation. The pollen, the male gametophyte, has sperm. When the pollen gets to the female reproductive parts of the plant, this pollen tube germinates down, and then sperm from the pollen tube fertilizes the egg. We get a diploid zygote. We also get something called the endosperm, which is actually a triploid tissue. We'll talk more about that in our next unit, though. That diploid zygote and the endosperm is contained within the seed, and that seed is contained within the fruit. And when that seed gets to the right area, it germinates and produces a mature diploid sporophyte generation. So again, angiosperms are relatively diverse. Our whole unit 2 is really more about angiosperm form and function, but here's several images of angiosperms there. So number 10, 2 ways gymnosperms are different than ferns. So gymnosperms have pollen and gymnosperms have seeds, so that's different than ferns. Also, gymnosperms have 2 kinds of spores, microspores and megaspores, whereas ferns only have 1 kind of spore. Number 11, 1 way angiosperms are different than gymnosperms. So Angiosperms have fruit and flowers, which gymnosperms do not have. Number 12, gymnosperms and angiosperms lack spores. Is that true or false? That is false. Gymnosperms and angiosperms and all other plants have spores. So all plants have spores. Gymnosperms and angiosperms just also have seeds and pollen. So we're going to talk more about these various plant structures that are coming up on the next couple slides in Unit 2, but we did talk about seeds. So a seed is a structure that has a protective seed coat, and it contains the embryo, which is the diploid sporophyte generation. It also has considerable stored food, and so sperm can reach the egg and fertilize the egg without having to swim through any water, and so that gets our little embryo produced there, and the embryo is protected within the seed. So that's an important feature of seed plants. We'll talk more about flowers in Unit 2 as well. Flowers are pretty complex reproductive structures. They're specialized for their production of pollen, seeds, and fruit. Some of them also attract pollinators. Again, we'll talk more about flowers coming up in Unit 2. But broadly speaking, we can talk about flower structures. So from kind of like a typical or idealized flower, there's this outer whorl, which is the sepals, and then the next layer or whorl in is the petals, and then there are the stamen, which produce the pollen, and then those are the male parts of the flower, and then the female parts of the flower is the pistil or carpels, which is made up of the stigma, the style, the ovary, and then inside the ovary are the ovules. The ovary, this outer part, matures into the fruit, and the ovules mature into the seed. So that ovule consists of an egg-producing female gametophyte, and then that's also surrounded by a protective layer of integument. And the female gametophyte develops from those larger megaspores. Again, we'll talk more about fruit in Unit 2, but fruit develops from the ovary walls of the flower, and fruit aids in the dispersal of seeds. I'm so glad this is not my dog, although sometimes my dog has picked those up, but that would be a lot of brushing, right? But those seeds are attached onto this dog, and they will get transported to a different area. Some seeds float, some seeds kind of fly in the wind, if you will, and some seeds make it through the digestive tract of an animal and then, come out on the other end with a little bit of fertilizer to help them get by. So plants and fungi evolved together in many ways, like we talked about, but plants have also evolved along with animals. So coevolution, co is sharing, right? So coevolution is when two or more species are sharing an evolutionary pathway. So really this helps explain the diverse forms of flowers and fruits. I think when people think about pollinators, many people think about bees, but there's also bats and other mammals and other kinds of insects that help pollinate plants as well. So there's something called pollination syndrome, which sounds like a bad thing, but it's not a bad thing. It's just talking about flower traits that have evolved in response to natural selection that's imposed on them by either biotic or abiotic pollen vectors. So what's the root word A mean? Not. And then bio means life. Basically this is saying pollination can occur by living things or by non-living things. So when pollinated flowers tend to be small and inconspicuous and green. Flowers that are pollinated by birds tend to be odorless and red or orange when they contain nectar. Flowers that are pollinated by bees tend to be blue or purple or yellow or white and have a sweet odor. Flowers that are pollinated by bats tend to have large flowers that are white or light colored and open at night and have strong odors that are sometimes sulfur scented. Sulfur scented is like rotting egg scented, and they contain nectar. Flowers that are pollinated by moths are open at night. They tend to have white or bright colored flowers and have a more musky odor. And then there are flowers that are pollinated by flies as well, and those tend to smell like either dung or dead animals. And this can be problematic. For example, if a pollinator becomes extinct, then the plant may also face extinction as well. So there's something called the prairie fringed orchid and the hawk moth. The hawk moth is heavily affected by agricultural pesticide application. So that's the only pollinator of the prairie fringed orchid. So that puts the prairie fringed orchid at risk. So there are people who are very dedicated to saving the prairie fringed orchid who go out and hand pollinate prairie fringed orchids to try and help that species stay around and conserve it. So we made it to the end of chapter 26. Chapter 26 basically is about plants and fungi and how they colonized land together. So our book goes in kind of a weird order because it like talks about plants, then it goes to fungi, and then it talks about plants again, and then it talks about both of them. So the way we went in our notes is we talked about fungi first, and we talked about the characteristics that make fungi fungi. So eukaryotic, single or multicelled, haploid dominant life cycle, sexual or asexual reproduction, cell walls, made of chitin. They are heterotrophic but tend to have absorptive nutrition. If they're multicellular, they have chains of cells that are called hyphae that make up their mycelium, and they can produce spores in sexual reproduction and sometimes also asexual reproduction. A single-celled fungus is called a yeast, right? And they reproduce asexually by budding. So we talked about fungi and their associations with plant roots. That's mycorrhizae. When plants have mycorrhizal fungi, that increases the root surface area. So the plants benefit from increased root surface area. The fungi benefit from resources from the plant. We talked about the ascomycetes and basidiomycetes for our two fungal groups to memorize. Ascomycetes produce their ascospores in a sac-like ascus, and their fruiting body is called an ascocarp. Basidiomycetes produce their basidiospores on club-like basidia in a fruiting body that's called a basidiocarp. Again, we talked about that haploid dominant life cycle for fungi and fungi reproducing sexually or asexually. Plants, what makes a plant a plant? Well, plants are eukaryotic. They have cells with cell walls made of cellulose. They have plastids. They're typically photosynthetic. They're multicellular, and they do that alternation of generations life cycle, and then they have spores, apical meristems, which is that tissue that continues to grow, a waxy cuticle, and stomata for gas exchange. We talked about the different plant groups. What is the representative of the bryophytes? I want you to know. That's the mosses. Remember, bryophytes or mosses are seedless plants. They don't have vascular tissue, and they are small in stature because they don't have a lignin, and they have to grow in moist environments because they have flagellated sperm. The monilophytes are the ferns, and they are the representatives of the seedless vascular plants, right? So that gives away part of it. They don't have seeds, but they do have vascular tissue. These guys are sporophyte dominant. They have one kind of spore. They still have to grow in moist environments because they still have flagellated sperm, no seeds, no fruits, no flowers. But they do have vascular tissue. So since they have vascular tissue, they can have true roots, stems, and leaves. That brings us to the gymnosperms. Our representative group there is the conifers. The gymnosperms in general are the negid seed plants. So they do have seeds. They are sporophyte dominant. They have vascular tissue, so they can have true roots, stems, and leaves. They have pollen, so they don't have to have flagellated sperm, and they can grow they can grow outside of moist environments, but they don't have flowers or fruits. So that brings us to the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. The angiosperms do have flowers and fruits. They also have vascular tissue and pollen and are sporophyte dominant. So then we talked about kind of importance of plants and fungi broadly. We talked about fungi being pathogenic, fungi being important for decomposition, fungi having partnerships with plants, and then we didn't really talk about like plant-animal interactions beyond pollination, but plants are super important for herbivores, other animals as well. Lots of things there. If I ask you why is a plant important question, you don't have to give me an example from the slide. Like you could say, I love eating plants. They are delicious, because some of them are very much so. So anyhow, we made it to the end of chapter 26.